Good morning. I'm Warner Lord. I'm here at the Everett's Archives once again with Phil Costello to continue our
Good morning.
Reminiscing with Phil series. We decided that this was number 7. We're going to be talking this morning about the Café LaFayette, one of Phil's favorite topics. And I thought I'd give a brief history of the Café before we get started.
Fire away. The
Café started as the unlikely situation of being a church, as you know. In 1836-38, when the Congregationalists got ready to build themselves a new church, they were trying to find where they would put this. And some dissension arose, and one group said, well, we don't really like where you've decided to put the church, so we're going to go build our own. And they went over to Main Street and built themselves a church. And as will happen, time passed, and I guess they must have regretted their move, and so they went back and rejoined the original church, which left a vacant building on Main Street. It turned out that there were a group of Methodists in town who had no church and were sort of casting about for a worship place, so they bought the church. And in probably 1939 or so, I guess later than that actually, maybe in the 1850s, the Methodist Church bought the building and established a church there, which they maintained until 1921. And because their membership was declining and they couldn't afford to maintain the building anymore, they merged with another church, I think the Clinton Church. And the building was sold to Mrs. Carrington, who happened to be running an inn right next door. So she combined the two buildings, converted the church to an inn, named it the Stevens Inn, and it flourished for years. I'm not precisely sure when she sold it. At one point, a gentleman named Harrigan and a partner named Cassell were running it. In 1964 is when our story gets started. Alfred Belmont, who'd been around town for quite a while, bought the building, took out a long-term lease, and renamed it the Café LaFayette. And it retained that name until, what, about 1993? Is that when it was finally sold?
Well, 90 was my final date, but
okay,
you're probably right.
All right. Well, anyway, Al bought it, and he and his wife and kids moved in, and he began operating a successful business. On Al's death, his son, AJ, took over, ran the business until 94. At that point it closed, the building was sold or renovated, and a new operation came in, known now as we know it as the Café Allegre. But our conversation today is going to be about the good old days. Phil?
I like to call it the Belmont Café Lafayette because that's where I spent so much of my time during the 60s and 70s and 80s, and became good friends with the family. And when Al passed away, I got permission from the family to do a eulogy for Al at his funeral. But the priest in charge of St. Margaret's told me that I couldn't give a eulogy during the Mass because it was against the church rules. So here's the eulogy, and today is my opportunity to read parts of it to you as we talk about the Café. But it's a good story. My eulogy began, "Dear family and friends of Al Belmont, we gather today to celebrate the life of a man who has greatly affected our lives. Al was born in West Haven, graduated from West Haven High School, Suffield Academy, and St. Michael's College in New Mexico. In high school, he was captain of 3 sports. He only weighed 150 pounds. He was labeled the Sparrow by his friend Ted Carr, being a small creature with a big heart. Well, Al symbolized that throughout his life. He was an all-state in football, an all-state end, which is remarkable for a 150-pound young man. And the girls at West Haven nicknamed Al the Body, which always embarrassed him. So I'll read more from the eulogy, but I'm so happy to get that out. I was allowed to give a 2-minute tail end of the Mass eulogy when Al passed away, but Al died in 88. It's hard to believe that many years have gone by, And then his son died in '89 of the same illness, Lou Gehrig's disease. Now the cafe, since 1964, when it was first opened under Al and Nancy's ownership of the business, not the building, I've jotted down some names of people that many of you will remember. Frank Holloway, Bill Berg, Jay Lennon, Bob Montgomery, Mike Montesanto, Art Haishi, Don Scharf, Ed Bartels, Carl King, Floyd Pattee, the napkin man whose name escapes me at the moment, but he's in the drawing on the wall, which I'll talk about in a minute, who is famous because he used so many napkins, and I'll explain that later. Pat Enright, Harry Begor, Jack Abeel, who later on bought the property because he wanted Al and Nancy to retire and move down to Florida and pal around with Jack. And they did do that. They sold it to Jack, and that's when Jack redid the sidewalks in front of the theater and down to the corner. And the Abeel family had a lot to do with the physical improvements of that whole end of Madison Main Street. And Billy O'Neill was one of the very early characters there, and Henry Sarasoli, and we'll talk about others later. On the wall, Warner, I brought home where I keep it hanging so I can look at it every day, is a sort of a cartoon collage that we used to maintain to the left of the bar when they moved the bar over to the west side of the building. Now, when Al and Nancy first opened up, they just had half of the building, and their entire restaurant was on the east side, which is still a dining room area, but then they had the bar set up at the north end of that room, and other dining tables to the rear of the building where the kitchen was located. But later on, this became sort of a daily challenge for me as a frustrated cartoonist, and I would draw little scenes and seat the people in my scenes at the bar saying things to each other, and it was like a comic strip, a constantly changing panorama. These are the people that we could locate when we closed up the restaurant, when the Allegre people or some in-between people were coming in, and we just put all of them up there that we could find. And up in the far left corner is a picture of Jack Abeel and his wife. They're the ones who bought the building and preserved it for the Belmont family, and as well as for the town of Madison. But I'll describe more of the people in that particular, what they call it, a collage.
That's what it looks like.
Of cartoons in a few minutes. A little more from the eulogy. Al married his childhood sweetheart, Nancy, and in 1957 they moved to Madison and bought a home on Forest Road. In 1963, possibly early '64, Al and Nancy took over the Café LaFayette. During the next 20 years, they worked hard to build the cafe into one of the outstanding shoreline restaurants. And in September of '84, they sold the property to Jack Abeel, and they retired to Florida because Jack, as I told you, wanted them to come down and see him more frequently. By 1984, Al and Nancy had acquired ownership of the entire building, so they're the ones that sold to Jack. You've heard earlier about how it was a church, and at one time it resembled the House of Seven Gables. There is a ghost in the attic at which Al would yell once in a while, and there was Harry the hamster owned by one of the boys. Al promised a burial at sea. Reminds me of the recent presidential campaign. Harry now resides at the bottom of Tux's Pond. To the kids at that time, that was a sea to them. Gertrude the rabbit is the most famous creature that actually lived. They acquired it one Easter to entertain the three boys. Gertrude hopped down the cellar stairs and enjoyed it so much down there, the family decided to make that Gertrude's home. And they fed it and took care of it down in the cellar. One day a delivery man from DiCello's was carrying kegs into the basement when he came running back upstairs and said, "Mr. Belmont, I ain't going down there anymore. There's a big albino rat down there." And that was the last they ever saw that delivery man. But that story has been legend ever since at the Café LaFayette. There's a wonderful guy who became the caretaker. I've got his picture here. I don't do very good at drawing caricatures of people, but I did one of Sonny Motley. And those of you who will remember Sonny, if you came early in the morning, he would be sweeping and cleaning and vacuuming. And he worked for the Belmonts until he retired and moved to Chicago, where Sonny owned a couple of buildings and had done quite well for himself by working all his life in Madison. He was my father-in-law's butler when I started courting my wife.
I remember seeing around.
And but Sonny was a delightful fellow, and he corresponded with me for like 15 years after he retired. When Jimmy Belmont went to fight for the United States in the Gulf, we had a big reception for him when he came home. This is this poster that we made up for it, but you'd be interested to know that Jimmy fought in both wars over there, and he just retired from the military this year. He's living in Florida where he sees his mother and his brother. His brother's gone into the restaurant business. The last I heard, he was managing a chain of Wolfgang Puck restaurants around the country, where he'd have to travel here, there, and see how they were doing. But that was a great part of the Belmont family. I mentioned that Al was an athlete, and the Little League field has a wonderful 1990 flagpole dedicated in memory of Al and A.J. Belmont, and donated by their friends. They had both passed away by then, but if you go down to the Little League, the first in town, in, what is it, Scotland Road? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Scotland Avenue it's on, actually, just before you get to Scotland Road. You will see the dedication to Al and Nancy and their family. Move on to more of the eulogy. On another occasion, Al was preparing for Christmas holiday festivities, expecting a large turnout for dinner. We inserted a mechanical bird in the ceiling above the bar. Now, most ceilings nowadays you can lift them right up to repair electrical work above them, and that's what we did with this bird. But when it chimed, you couldn't tell where it was. And every 15 seconds, the bird would whistle a long descending shrill, followed by 7 or 8 chirps at the end. Then there would be another 15-second delay, so you couldn't trace the sound, and then it would repeat. And this went on for about a half an hour, and finally Al was going crazy. And he even got to the point where he was doing body searches of his customers to see who was hiding this evil device. Well, about 2 hours later, just before Al had a complete nervous breakdown, we revealed the source of the noise and allowed him to spend the rest of the evening in tranquility. But that was the wildest night he ever spent there, chasing that bird, and he had all the waitresses looking for it. And I think the people at his eulogy would have enjoyed that story. Another memory that I cherish is Al's 200-yard foot race with Carl King. Al having been an athlete and Carl King having been one of the town's best athletes at Hand High School. At the conclusion of business one night at 1 o'clock in the morning, Al went up and got his sneakers, and Carl and Al lined up at the post office intersection with Carvin Pallenberg as the starter in his car. And they were to run to the firehouse where I was the finish line. The race started, and unbeknownst to us, a police car was parked in the garage across the street from the firehouse, watching the entire proceedings. It was a neck-and-neck race, and I don't recall who won. It was so close. But while we were discussing who won, the policeman pulled up and inquired what was going on. Well, to make a long story short, we told him it was nothing but a friendly race between a couple of buddies, at which point the officer gave Carvin Pallenberg a ticket for making an illegal U-turn in front of the post office. Carvin will enjoy this. But the cafe became a gathering place for politicians from both parties, and frequently after town committee meetings, people would adjourn to the cafe. I never saw any violence take place. It was always very friendly, but kind of controversial and loud. People loved to talk politics. And Al and Nancy never took a role. I never to this day knew how they voted or whose side they were on. But the late night after, Al considered the cafe his home because his family moved in upstairs and raised all their kids there. And when the business was closed, the kids used the entire building as their home, as I told you about the rabbit earlier. But he would invite one or two friends at the end of the evening to go back by the fireplace and discuss the goings of the day. And that's the memory of many people in Madison who had the opportunity to spend an evening there. And I can remember leaving when the sun was rising. It was so interesting, and Al could stay up all night. I don't know how he did it, but Nancy loved to dress him up. And Al probably was one of the best dressed men in Madison for many years, his wardrobe having been hand-selected by his wife. And he was a good-looking man with white sideburns, which I always envied. And so I've grown some now in memory of Al. A little more than that, but this is because I can't raise my right hand enough to shave anymore, so I decided to grow the whole beard. But I got to tell you some more stories about Al. Al was a reserve on our softball team. I just mentioned what a well-dressed man he was. And one Friday evening, we called the cafe desperately seeking a 9th player so we would not forfeit down at the surf club. So Al shows up all dressed up with his bow tie and formal pants and black shiny shoes, fancy slacks. Well, it had rained that afternoon, and Al hit the ball on the ground and started to run to first. He slipped and landed flat on his face. So that night when he went back to his wife to be the host, he was a real picture to behold, and he took a bit of a ribbing from her for volunteering to play in the rain. But he did sacrifice himself for the benefit of our team, and we won the game. Golf tournaments were a big thing at the Café LaFayette. They started off one year with a few of the frequenters deciding to see if people would participate, and they got about 30 people to show up for the first year. And they had a big party down Surf Club, and lots of funny gifts were given out. A doctor from Guilford won the Best Dressed Award. He wore the wildest golf outfits I have ever seen, even in comedy on television. And he's since passed away, but he won like every other year for his golf. He would go out of his way to buy a crazy looking golf outfit. But the tournament became so popular that it got up to all we could hold, which was 144 people. That is a huge crowd, and we didn't know what to do with them after the tournament. The cafe could hardly hold 140 people. But it finally had to be discontinued just because it was too popular. But it was a great part of the cafe. Does our guest here today, who wishes to remain anonymous, remember how many people showed up at the first one?
First one was about 30, 35, as you said. Yes.
Thank you. I knew I'd get you to say something. This is a real surprise because this guy knows more about the cafe than I do, but he's very shy, except when he gets to the cafe. Okay. Well, speaking of sports, as I told you, Al was a great football player, and this year Hand won the state football championship, and Al's grandson was the fullback for that team, and I think scored the last touchdown of the year. I haven't had a chance to review the film, but I think he was the last one to score, and they were way ahead, so I'm not hurting anyone's feelings too badly if I put him in the wrong place, but is named after Al, and it was quite a tribute to the family to have Daniel Hand high school football do so well. One of the groups that latched onto the Café was Yuppie Hollow Country Club. And we can do a whole program on Yuppie Hollow. I'll just tell one brief summary of it, where I was having an argument with the Madison Country Club because they asked people wait in line to become members, but they had to put up a $350 deposit. But I learned, I was no longer on the board of directors, but I learned that the guys who were waiting weren't getting in, and friends of some of the executive committee were getting in as new members. So I started a protest meeting. We decided to create a fictitious country club called Yuppie Hollow. And we put a little ad in the paper saying that we were going to sign up members. It was $25 for a lifetime membership. And of course, we'd spend all that on the first party we had to sign them up. Don LaChance, who later became our first selectman and was on one of our previous shows, he was the guy who did the calligraphy for their names on our certificate. And we were sitting there with 25 t-shirts all ready to hope that 25 people would show up. Well, 64 people lined up in front of the cafe. It was amazing. It took us all evening to do all those new memberships and promise them t-shirts, and we gave away $21 worth of benefits, including t-shirts and a framed guest or membership certificate to everybody who joined. And to make a long story short, most of the people that joined didn't even know what it was all about, but they didn't belong to a country club. And so now, for 25 bucks, they had a certificate they could hang on a wall saying they belonged to Yuppie Hollow Country Club, which we thought was an appropriate name. And the country club downtown did change its rules so that members that were on the waiting list now get some value for being on the waiting list and become members as soon as they're eligible. So perhaps we can do another program about Yuppie Hollow. We used to film those, and so they're already partly on film. Benny Lipnicki, who was a great frequenter of the Café LaFayette, was the star of Yuppie Hollow because he had written a letter to the Hartford Courant, which women did not like. And so we decided to have a trial of Vince Lipnicki and to see if he was deserving to remain a member or be thrown out. And that became one of the best evenings of my life. And I was the prosecutor, and Peter, what's his name? Mystery man in the back of the room, Peter, he's an insurance agent in Madison. You know him better than you know me. Peter.
Peter Newcomb.
Yeah, thank you. I knew you'd come in handy. Peter Newcomb's a good friend of mine too, but I have a mental block on some names. Peter Newcomb was the defense lawyer, and he defended in front of this crowd of about 60 people so beautifully that the jury found him not guilty unanimously. But that's a whole show. Here's another drawing. I'll leave these drawings here in case anybody wants to stop in the archives and look at them, but this was a program at the Café LaFayette where Abe Lincoln was our guest of honor. And it was a press conference with President Lincoln at 7 p.m. And it was a sold-out Civil War memorial program that was conducted at the Café. Here's a cartoon showing the crowd that would gather for football games. The Belmonts had at first no television downstairs. It was only when we opened up the bigger bar in the enlarged restaurant that they put the TV down at the end of the bar. And on the weekends, they'd show the pro football games, but if it was an important game, they'd put it up on the top of about 6 beer cases. So you could tell how important the game was by the number of beer cases. The New England power blackout, many of you will remember that. There was no electric power all over New England, and people gathered at the cafe like homing pigeons. I mean, that place was wall to wall, and I'll never forget the fun we had in the dark. Lots of candles were there, but when it used to snow, a good snowstorm, people would ski down the street, down the Boston Post Road, and come to the cafe. And that was another social event that happened based on the weather. And Al and Nancy welcomed everyone who would put on a pair of skis and come down. And they always had a great time, as people do in snowstorms. So I mentioned that in my eulogy. I still can't remember the name of the napkin man, but he's in that picture on the far left, taking a sip out of a beer. That's all he ever drank was a German beer. He was a German. His family ran a motel in Clinton. But after each sip, he would wipe his mouth and tear off a piece of a napkin and wipe his mouth and wad it up and put it in a little ball where he sat. And some nights he'd have 200 or 300 balls all wound up there waiting to be taken away. And when he was ready for another beer, he'd fold a dollar bill on its side so he could point it at the bartender, and that would be his silent signal that he was ready for another beer. And he always sat in that corner if he could get to it. And he was very friendly, but he never spoke to anyone. If someone spoke to him, he would chat away with them, and you'd think he was the most verbal guy in the world. But unless someone spoke to him first, he would just sit there and sip his beers by the hour. And he became quite a legend, and everybody enjoyed seeing him there. Now the people in that, what would you call that? A collage, I call it, but a collection of cartoon characters, including Al Belmont, who is on the left third behind the bar. Then the next one in the center of the bar with the curly hair is his son Jimmy Belmont, who did 2 stitches in the Gulf War. And AJ, his son Albert J. Belmont Jr., is sort of a whitish character in the beginning of the right third of the cartoon. So I got everybody but the younger son, who wasn't very active in the bar, and he was too young. But now, as I told you, he works for Wolfgang Puck.
What was the younger son's name?
Jeffrey.
Jeffrey.
And Jeffrey lives in Florida and is doing very well. And but anyway, the other characters at the bar are frequently known customers. Don Scharf is in the middle with his Yale shirt on. I've got a story in the eulogy I got to tell you about Jimmy Martin. Where is it? Jimmy Martin, who grew up in Clinton, and his father was a police chief there, which will help some of you remember him. And he was the first guy I worked with when I came here and when I was in college. And he and I unloaded trucks for the Clinton Lumber Company. So I've known Jimmy a long time. And one day Jim Martin sat at the bar explaining to Al in great detail how he could rob the new bank in Killingworth. Now they built this little bank. There was no commercial district in Killingworth, but the bank decided they needed a branch there, so they built it just north of Route 80, about a mile. And he said, boy, if I ever need money, it would be such an easy mark, and escape would be so easy in a town that had only one state trooper. When Jim got through with his detailed plan, Al introduced him to the man sitting to his right, who was Tom Dugan, the new head of the FBI for Connecticut. And Tom's in that cartoon up there sitting at the far right of the bar, and he was a real gentleman, and he's retired, and he loved Al and Nancy and used to stop in, but he behaved himself. It was hard for people in the FBI to find places to live. I remember we had a guy that ran a small rooming house in Madison, and he was not an American citizen. And he was afraid to rent to the guy that succeeded Dugan as the head of the FBI, because the FBI might find out he was maybe not a legal immigrant. It all worked out, but that guy had quite a time finding a place to stay when he was here. Jack Beal, as I mentioned, bought the property, fixed it up very nicely, and as he did for much of the downtown of Madison. And Jack has since passed away too, but he was a dear friend of mine. He was distantly related to my wife, and I was married once, but that ended in 1974. But anyway, I remember going to a dinner party with Jack Beal, and I remember teasing him. I said, you know, I'm still related to you, Jack, even though it was through my wife, because I just found out that Haitian divorces aren't recognized in Connecticut. Well, everybody at the dinner table laughed. I knew, as a lawyer who did many divorces, that they were recognized in Connecticut, but my wife didn't believe me. And she actually hired a lawyer up in Litchfield to start another divorce action. That's how serious she was about it. Well, we patched it all up and he withdrew the case, but you got to be careful what you say in public. That's all the message is there. I mentioned Henry Sarasoli. Henry used to run a lot of the golf tournaments, even though he didn't play golf, and he's a dear friend of Al and Nancy. Our two barbers across the street downtown decided they would like to film it, and we always like to have people contribute films, as this program is a good example. So Richie and Tony got together, got their camera equipment, rented a cart, and they were going to be the official filmmakers for 1 year's tournament. When we got all through and looked at the film, it was an hour of Richie and Tony having a beer, Richie and Tony doing this. Neither one of them played much golf, so there was very little golf in the movie. They went around, shook hands with a lot of people, but we didn't get to see any golf shots that I can remember. And that was one of the highlights of we do have some pretty good filmed programs that are bouncing around town, but Richie and Tony just celebrated their 40th anniversary at that barbershop. And I stumbled in there because I hadn't been getting haircuts, as you can see, and I needed somebody to trim my beard. And at the end of that, Richie presented me with a 40th anniversary gift from Richie and Tony, celebrating their 40 years. That's how I can give them a quick plug here. Not to take anything away from Chino across the street, with whom I played golf and is also a good friend and good barber. Jay Lennon was such a character, if you remember him. He used to visit the Café LaFayette, and then he got to liking the business so much he opened one in Westbrook all by himself. And he would sing. He would never admit to any theatrical training, but he had a great voice. The only problem was his voice drowned out the whole restaurant. And when he would start singing late in the evening, some people enjoyed it and some people got up and left because it was so loud. But Jay was he was a good golfer and a true friend of Al and Nancy. Jay passed away last year. We had a lot of touch football teams in the old days, and we even had the captain of the Yale football team on our team one year. And they frequented the Café after the Sunday morning touch games. And we got to play in a championship up in Wallingford. And we won, and they wouldn't give us a trophy because we were from out of town. And in that game, our Yale football captain, who did a real job on this 300-pound guy they had on their team, and our guy probably weighed 180, and he kept them from ever touching our quarterback. And the guy got so frustrated, he got into a fist fight with our guy at the end of the game. And the referees broke it up, they both dropped their hands, and all of a sudden the guy threw one last sucker punch and knocked out our guy. They threw them out unceremoniously. And so not only wouldn't they give us our trophy, but they wouldn't even apologize for sucker punching our best player. So put that down in your scrapbook.
All right.
Okay. This is a type of poster we'd put up for a Yuppie Hollow meeting, and everybody would come to the cafe, and we'd have, an average of 30 or 40 people, and there was no dinners involved, but the Dewey was
The famous Dewey.
famous Dewey, about whom we could do another program.
Yes, we could.
And I have a whole cartoon book of about 150 Dewey cartoons. Dewey always wore a red jumpsuit. And he would, wherever he went to drink, and he loved to drink, so he was frequenting the Stag's Head, the Dolly Madison, the Café, the Wharf, every place, the Woodlawn. He wore his red jumpsuit, which is shown in that cartoon. So I'd always stick him into my cartoons because everybody recognized him, just like Mickey Mouse is recognized by everybody. I'm talking to Warner here about donating my lifetime collection of cartoons because I never became a professional and never was good enough in my own mind to try to publish. I did one when I graduated from law school, and we did sell enough of those to throw a party for our graduating class of 500 guys. They didn't all come, thank God, but that was the only thing I ever copyrighted. And I hope to leave my collection to Warner's archives here. No, but this was what I was allowed to say in church in between masses. They had back-to-back funeral masses, and I got up there and I said, if Al could be here beside me today, I think he would speak the same words that Lou Gehrig spoke to 61,000 fans at Yankee Stadium on July 4th, 1939. Al would say, today I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. And that's how I'd like to conclude this tribute to the Belmont family.
Thank you, Phil. Your pleasure as always. I'd like to remind you all that if you're interested in viewing any or all of these programs, all 7, they are available at the Scranton Memorial Library. You may take them out, take them home, and enjoy them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.